Students, welcome back to our next topic, topic number 12. And this topic will be our last topic in Unit 2. So why don't we just get started with our topic here for today, which happens to be the fourth kingdom of organisms that we have been learning about so far this year. And just out of curiosity, I wonder if any of you can remember the first of the first three kingdoms of organisms that we've already discussed this year. Can you name them? Now, it doesn't matter what order you identified them in, but did you remember Kingdom Moneron, the first kingdom of organisms made up of bacteria? Kingdom Protista, the second kingdom of organisms made out of unicellular organisms. And Kingdom Fungi, which is made out of me. Fungi. No, just kidding. All of the fungus that exist on planet Earth. So we have talked about three kingdoms of organisms so far, and today we begin the fourth kingdom of organisms, which is known as Kingdom Plantae. Kingdom Plantae in Latin, or for the rest of us, the plant kingdom. The plant kingdom we are going to be spending a few weeks on before we get to the fifth and final kingdom of organisms for us to discuss this year, which will be the animal kingdom or Kingdom Animalia, and we'll spend the rest of the year on that kingdom. But before we get to the animals, let's stick with the plants. So Kingdom Plantae, we're dividing this particular section into several different topics, beginning with topic 12 today. And we're calling the subtopic here the primitive plants. Now, as you're looking at this picture, how many of you are tempted to just put your face close to the screen and just lick up the contents of this person's hand? Doesn't that look yummy? I mean, after all, it does look delicious and scrumptious. Now, some of you might be going, ew, that's gross. But by the end of this week, you may come to realize that what you are looking at in this picture right now is more scrumptious than you might first think. Yes, it looks like a handful of algae. And guess what? You're right, it is. But it is so much more, as we will learn to discover this week. So let's begin here today with our primitive plants of Kingdom Plantae. And let's go over to the right slide here. Here we go. Okay, so when you think of plants, what comes to mind? Just shout out a couple of answers. First things that come to your mind when you think of plants. Yeah, you may have called out some of the things in this picture itself. You know, trees and flowers. Maybe you identified grass and other kinds of plants. And you're not wrong. When most of us think of plants, we think of land plants. Many of us think of flowering plants, plants that we have planted ourselves or watched grow in our own yard or even in our home, plants that we consume. You know, when we think of plants, those are the kinds of plants that many of us think of. But did you know that most of the plants on planet Earth are not those kinds of plants? Yes, most of the plants on our planet are actually what we would call primitive plants, unicellular or multicellular plants that we might just shrug off as pond scum. And it sounds gross, but it's true. Most of the plants on our planet are not the things we might at first think of. But let's continue with this theme of kingdom plantae and come up with a generalized description or definition of, well, what constitutes or what makes up a plant in the first place. So, in your notes, and make sure you have your books open at this time, we will be going through our notes. And remember, you are filling in the red, bold words in your notebooks. So, what can we say about all plants? Well, all plants, no matter what kind of plant we're talking about, all plants in the context of Kingdom Plantae are multicellular organisms. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. What does the word multicellular mean? That's right. If you said it is many cells, then you are correct. You are absolutely correct. That multicellular, we can contrast with unicellular. And our last topic, when we learned about protists, those were all unicellular organisms. And if you recall, some of those protists were plant-like. Now, just because they were plant-like didn't make them plants, because they were unicellular, which is why they were in the protist kingdom. If those organisms we talked about last week were multicellular, well, then we would fit them into this category under the plant kingdom. Well, what are some other things? What are some other characteristics of all plants? All plants are autotrophs. And that is a term that should be familiar to you by now. An autotroph is an organism that feeds itself, thus the name auto, self, troph, feeding. It is a self-feeding organism. And how does it do that? Well, through the process of photosynthesis. So here's a good question for you. In order for an organism like a plant to be an autotroph or photosynthetic, what must it have inside its cellular structure? What organelles must they have, and what must be found in those organelles? Any idea? I'll give you a hint. It's green. If you said chlorophyll, you are absolutely correct, because all plants, again, they're multicellular, they are autotrophs, and they are capable of being autotrophs because they have chlorophyll within their cells. And that chlorophyll is that chemical that enables these plants to take the carbon dioxide from the air and convert it into oxygen that we need to breathe. It's that process that enables them to take the carbon dioxide that we breathe out to produce the oxygen that we breathe. And it's also the process where it takes in water with that carbon dioxide and turns it into sugar. The food that we get from plants comes through this process of photosynthesis, which is only possible with chlorophyll. In fact, scientists really haven't completely been able to explain precisely what happens in the process of photosynthesis. Parts of this process still remain a mystery to us, believe it or not. All right, so what else do plants have? What else do all plants have? This goes back to the very first marking period and early in the year when we were talking about the difference between plant cells and animal cells. Who can tell me, what do all plants have that animal cells do not have? Did you say cell walls? I hope you did, because that's the right answer. In fact, you can see it in this picture here. Plant cells have cell walls. Why? Well, you may recall that cell walls provide support and protection. It provides support for the plants because if you recall, plants don't have endoskeletons like we do. And if they didn't have cell walls, if all they had were cell membranes, well, no plant would be able to stand up on its own 2 feet. Oh, wait a minute. Plants don't have 2 feet, do they? No, they have stems and roots, or at least land plants do. All right, so let's continue with our list here. So in your notes, make sure you've got all of these copied down. All plants are multicellular organisms. They are all autotrophic. They all have chlorophyll and they all have cell walls. But as I said earlier in the period, what we're going to be focusing on this week are primitive plants. So what makes primitive plants slightly different than the other plants that we're going to be talking about? Well, first, let me emphasize the point that all of those characteristics we just went over are still characteristics with primitive plants. All primitive plants have all of those characteristics. But one thing that distinguishes them from other kinds of plants is that they are plants with simple structures. Later on in subsequent topics, we're going to be talking about really complex structures with angiosperms and gymnosperms and different kinds of flowering plants and the different parts that make them up. And it's really fascinating. We're going to get into that in a couple of weeks. But primitive plants don't have all of those complicated structures. And the opposite of complicated is simple. You might say those are antonyms to one another. And the word primitive and simple are synonyms with one another. They mean the same thing. So primitive plants, again, are plants with simple structures. Now, what else does it mean? Well, primitive plants do not produce seeds. What? Some of you might be saying. Well, wait a minute. How can a plant give forth a new plant? How can it reproduce without seeds? Relax. We're going to find out this week. But not all plants, in fact, most plants on the planet do not produce seeds. So, what else can we say about primitive plants? Well, they are multicellular, and one of the biggest categories of primitive plants that we're going to be focused on are multicellular algae. Multicellular algae. There are 3 different groups of multicellular algae: the red, the brown, and the green. So let's talk a little bit in general about multicellular algae before we get into the 3 specific groups. So first, multicellular algae. As the name implies, multicellular means that they are made of many cells. So even this microscopic picture here of multicellular algae, if the cells are connected into a uniform structure with many cells, we can call that multicellular algae. But what are some other characteristics of multicellular algae? Well, once again, because they are plants, multicellular algae are also autotrophic. They're autotrophs, which, as you know, means they make their own food because they contain chlorophyll. And once again, we can see this process here where water and carbon dioxide enter into a plant that is an autotroph. And in the presence of sunlight, a chemical reaction takes place called photosynthesis that produces oxygen and food in the form of a type of sugar or carbohydrate. That we depend on both, by the way. We need to breathe the oxygen and we need the food. And then we release waste materials. The waste materials we release include carbon dioxide gas. We breathe it out. And one of our liquid wastes is water. So plants produce this fantastic cycle along with us as an example of animals where things are cycled through the environment. Plants are thankful for us, and we are thankful for animals, or rather plants, because animals and plants have what we call a symbiotic relationship. Even more specifically, a mutualistic symbiotic relationship where we both benefit from one another. Isn't that a wonderful thing, how we can benefit from one another? Now, let's get back to multicellular algae. Multicellular algae, unlike many of the plants that we might be familiar with here on land, multicellular algae must live in or near the water. And there's a reason for this. Again, multicellular algae are an example of a primitive plant, meaning simple structures, not complicated. So they don't have roots or stems. And without roots or stems, well, you just can't be planted in the ground. It just won't work that way. If there are no roots to extract nutrients from the soil, the plant would die. Without a stem to hold yourself up, you just flop on over. Multicellular algae, which lack roots and stems, they don't need them because when you're living in the water holds you up. The water provides the support you need for your cells, and it's through the water from which you obtain the nutrients that you need in order to survive. So you don't need roots. So it's kind of cool that these multicellular algae and other primitive plants are so well adapted to an aquatic environment because of their simple structure. And as we said before, multicellular algae, as an example of primitive plants, do not have seeds. And so multicellular algae, as well as other primitive plants, do not reproduce by means of seeds. They reproduce in other ways, and we'll get into that in a little while. So these are the characteristics, the general characteristics of multicellular algae. Make sure you have these written down in your notes. And then we will begin to talk about the three main groups of multicellular algae. We've got the brown alga, the red alga, and the green alga. And before we go on, you may notice the change in spelling of words. Alga is singular. Algae is plural. So brown alga is one. Algae is a whole bunch of them. So alga, singular, algae, plural. So let's begin with brown algae now, shall we? How now, brown cow? Oh, wait, cows are the next kingdom of organisms. Let's stick with algae right now. So here's the deal. Most brown algae live in the ocean. If you've ever been to the seashore, how many of you have ever been to the seashore? To the beach? To the shore? Have any of you seen Sally there? Because Sally sells seashells by the seashore. Say that 3 times real fast. Sally sells seashells by the seashore. It took me years to get that, by the way. But if you've ever spent any time at the shore, whether it's the Jersey Shore or the California Shore or any other beach around the world, undoubtedly you've probably seen some seaweed washing up on shore. If you've ever seen seaweed, seaweed is a type of brown algae. Most of them live in the ocean. In fact, one example of brown algae, and there are others, is something called kelp, otherwise known as seaweed. And the giant variety of kelp can grow up to 100 meters high. And it's edible, which means you can eat it. Now let me explain a few things while you're writing this down. 100 meters. I know many of you may not be all that familiar or comfortable with the metric system. So let me put this into terms you can more fully understand. 100 meters is a little bit more than 100 yards. And so how big is 100 yards? Well, it's about the length of a football field. So imagine taking a football field and tipping it up on its end. So you're standing in one end zone and looking up to the other end zone instead of out. That's about 100 meters. That's pretty tall. It's almost as tall as the Statue of Liberty, which is 365 feet tall. So 300 feet tall, probably 320, 300. You know what? 100 meters is almost as tall as the Statue of Liberty. That's pretty tall. And giant kelp, a plant, can grow that tall with no root and no stem. How? The water holds it up. Yeah, because they live in the ocean. And as I said, kelp is also edible. How many of you have ever had sushi? If you've ever had sushi, I would imagine that sushi may have been rolled up in something. I don't eat raw fish myself. I would actually, I shouldn't say that. Tuna fish. I like tuna fish, but I'm not big into sushi. But I know people who are, and it's usually rolled up in kelp, seaweed, and they eat it. They eat the whole thing. And there are many different varieties of kelp or seaweed, but you get the idea. You get the idea. Kelp is edible, which means you can eat it. How many of you have ever eaten seaweed? Okay. All right. All right. There's another variety here called sargassum. Sargassum, another example of a brown algae, is known as a floating algae. And I'm going to show you a picture here that will really explain why it floats so well. But first, let me ask you this. How many of you learned to swim when you were really, really young? Have you ever seen little kids learning to swim and they put those little floaties on their arms so that their arms float in the water? Have you ever seen those cute little floaties on their arms? Well, sargassum is kind of a cute seaweed that has little floaties. In fact, all of these little globular structures, these spheres, filled with air. They're filled with oxygen, in fact, and they help sargassum to float on the top of the water. It's actually pretty cool. If you've ever been to the Jersey Shore, you undoubtedly have probably seen at one point or another some seaweed that looks like this floating up onto the beach with these little bubbles on it. And I have to imagine if you're anything like me, if you saw seaweed like this, you probably picked it up and popped the little bubbles. Pop, 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 pop. Come on, be honest. How many of you have ever done that yourself? All right. If you've ever seen bubble wrap, how many of you ever popped the bubble wrap? Pop, 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 pop. I love popping bubble wrap, especially the big bubbles instead of the little bubbles. But be that as it may, these little bubbles help the algae to float on the surface of the water. And it has some really important impacts here in this region of the world. I'm going to give you some more information here. Check this out. Excuse me. So sargassum is known as the floating algae, and there's a geographic region of the Atlantic Ocean called the Sargasso Sea. The Sargasso Sea. The Sargasso Sea, and I'll just show you here a map. This region here between Miami and Florida, San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Bermuda, this part of the Atlantic Ocean is known as the Sargasso Sea. And the Sargasso Sea actually goes in this direction, spirals around in a circle. It's like a giant sink or bathtub going around and around and around because of the Coriolis effect that you learned about last year with planet Earth. Now, this Coriolis effect gives rise to an area of increased concentration of sargassum, the seaweed. And that region also happens to be in a particular shape. Have any of you recognized it yet? A triangle. And at the top of the triangle is the island of Bermuda. And in fact, the Sargasso Sea's center is and has also been called the Bermuda Triangle. So at this time, I am going to have you watch a couple of interesting videos about the Sargasso Sea, the floating algae. And I'd like you to think about some possible explanations for the reason why this Bermuda Triangle is filled with such mystery. So for now, I'm going to say bye-bye, hopefully not forever, and I would like you to watch these videos on the Sargasso Sea.